Okay, that's much better. I hope I'm not transgressing on anyone's prerogative to open the session this morning, but I am conscious, as we all, of course, are, and I'm reminded that we have piles of books to read and other things to do, that time does march on. And so I thought I would, as I like to do, then make the best use of time by simply, and I do apologize if there was meant to be an opening, by simply starting, if that's okay. So I hadn't expected to start in that particular way, and I was going to say that I have a very easy way to start today, which is good for me because I always struggle to start, as you know. But before I start, I simply also want to thank you so much for turning up here today, and also for your kind words in the emails. And yes, this is a highlight for me as well. I had no idea what to expect when I started with Osher, and I was ever so excited actually to be here today, which, you know, the night before is a wonderful feeling. So thank you for making that feeling possible. I do appreciate it. They are generally rare and hard to come by, so I certainly do appreciate your presence. The reason why it is easy for me to start is because I was invited to reflect on Nelson Mandela's childhood. And so one of the questions was, well, who was he as a child? Now, I don't want to dwell on that for any great length of time, but I do want to do justice to the question and respect all the questions, and indeed I look forward to the questions and answers, perhaps the questions, because I try my best to answer. And so let me very briefly reflect on Mandela, the youngster, and then move onwards with the program as I've kind of put it out across the 6 lectures. So the use by Samson of the words country boy and mission boy as titles of chapters, if you were to summarize succinctly and pithily his childhood, you could easily do it literally under those two headings, which of course is why the biographer has chosen those headings. They're pithy and apposite, in my view, summaries of the early influences that shaped Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela's father was an hereditary chief who indeed lost his position as a chief after a spat with the then British governor of that territory that Mandela and his father were living in. So Mandela grew up in a polygamous family. Hendry, with a D, Hendry Mandela. Nelson Mandela's father had 4 wives. When we heard from Mandela, when we were finally allowed to hear from Mandela, he decried that familial structure. He said, and I quote from page 8, "It's quite inexcusable. It shows contempt for women, and it's something I discourage fully, or totally." His royal heritage fortified, if you like, his political confidence. It bolstered his political confidence, so that's another aspect of his childhood that was important. And that, when Mandela's father died at a young age, was further bolstered by the fact that Mandela went to go and live in a place called the Great Place. The Great Place being the place which belonged to the regent of the Tembu, a tribe, and the regent became, and at this stage it's important then to recognize that we need to call Nelson Mandela not Nelson, but Rolihlahla. And so, yeah, I know the pronunciation is a funny one, isn't it? And so the regent became Rolihlahla's father figure. Another important aspect before I move on is the fact that Mandela, in this royal upbringing, yes sir, sorry. That's okay.
Did I get the idea that the governor could appoint and remove a chief?
Yes.
What's the point in his being a chief?
No, there wasn't. In terms, so the point from a British perspective, would have been, you either work with us or we fire you. You either, as a chief, you either do what we say, or we have the power to remove your chieftainship. And that is exactly what happened then to Mandela's, and not only Mandela's father, but also Mandela's father. You're welcome. Sorry, I didn't realize you were, I do apologize. Now, in this royal place, of course, it is a place of where there's a lot of civic activity happening. Folk get appointed to positions, there's legal stuff happening, there are decisions to be made, and so the style of decision making is something Mandela became acquainted with and grew up with in this royal place. And if one wants to characterize the nature of this way of doing things, this African way of doing things, then we could talk about the fact that he was influenced from a very early life by this thing called Ubuntu. Have you heard of Ubuntu? It's most unfortunate that you haven't, and I'm glad I have the opportunity to share with you a little bit of the African way of seeing things as epitomized in this word Ubuntu, which is a quality of compassion and mutual responsibility for one's fellow human being, and a compassionate stance, a compassionate way, default position of engagement. In fact, Desmond Tutu, and surely we could do a series on Tutu, and so Desmond Tutu describes it quite well, I think, when he talks about this essence, this way of being, which is captured by the words umuntu, ngumuntu, ngabantu. And so what that in essence means is a person or a human being is a person, a human being, only through other people. That's, if you want to try and capture the essence of that which Mandela grew up with as a child, it would be Ubuntu. A person is a person because of or through other people. Of equal note to his royal heritage and upbringing is then his mission education, a Methodist mission education, something Mandela always retained a respect for. In fact, when he was finally let out of jail, he tried to get folk back together that were at school with him. And I think we have some sort of homecoming coming up. And so he did the same thing as best he could. He always retained a respect for his missionary education, despite the fact that he linked it with colonialism and oppression, imperialism and paternalism. And we can talk about why that is. And so he owes, the last point I want to make about his childhood, because I know we want to move on, is he owes, so Nelson Mandela had a number of names. Black people in South Africa continue to, but under apartheid, had a number of names. And so Nelson, when he was born, wasn't known as Nelson. He was Rolihlahla. That was his name. Where did he get the name Nelson from? Well, from his missionary educators. A teacher at school decided he needed a European name. They named black children after European figures, heroes, etc. And so you know who Nelson refers to. Yeah. So that's Nelson Mandela. Rolihlahla is his name, is the way you might call me Clive. It's my name. Dalibunga is another name you might have heard. And that's the name that he gets when he's circumcised. And circumcision is hugely important in the Xhosa culture, because that act of circumcision and what happens to those young men in the transition to manhood, which is an entire rite, and we could probably spend 6 lectures talking about that too, is that without the circumcision, a man is not recognized as a man. A man might be 100 years old and would still be a boy in the eyes of the Xhosa without that act. So the spear, which is of tribal significance, imbued with the spirits of the ancestors, is used to perform the act, and the boy becomes man. His name then was Dalibunga. Yes, sir. That's around puberty, sort of the time you would expect. Sort of that time you would expect. They're painted white, they're sent into the bush for a few months, they struggle there, they get circumcised there, they heal there. When they come out, they're a man. Yes, sir.
It's probably intuitive to everybody else, but back to the names, the European names. What is Nelson associated with?
There you go.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's what I said.
The great, the great war hero. The great Nelson. You will have heard of Madiba. And in fact, we South Africans, when we get misty-eyed and emotional, talk about him as Tata Madiba. Madiba is his clan name. So besides the fact that he was an individual, he belonged to a clan. Madiba is that clan's name. Tata Madiba. Tata is Xhosa for father. We call him Father Madiba, Tata Madiba. And there is another name, which if I can get to it, I certainly will, because I do want to talk about, here I go, I always make statements like this, CIA complicity in his arrest and subsequent incarceration. Have any of you been to his home in Soweto? So some of you have been to his home. Did you see the note on the wall where he had petitioned one of your state legislatures for recognition that the CIA had been complicit in his arrest? It's there, it's hanging there. And recently, in fact, it comes back to me as I speak, and I think it's an MIT student was trying to revive all of this and bring it out into you might find it on the internet and remind me as well. I'd forgotten about that. David Motsamai was a cover name. And I hope to show you footage of where he talks about himself as David Motsamai. I think that's a reasonably succinct and pithy short survey, thumbnail sketch of his childhood. I hope I've done it reasonable justice. I do want to take us now back to where we were, if that's okay, and just potentially overlap a little bit to refresh my memory and yours, back to the 35th Annual Congress of the ANC in December 1951, which was an historic turning point for the African National Congress. And the question, of course, is why was it such a historic turning point? Well, it was at that point, for the first time, that Walter Sisulu, one of Mandela's mentors and a close friend, and someone who had been forming and building up the African National Congress in Johannesburg at the time, had produced a formally written up, carefully constructed plan of civil disobedience, aimed at deliberately defying the nationalist government's racial and racist laws that were emerging post-48, if you will recall. Not only did the plan draw up details about what kinds of actions might be taken, it also for the first time suggested something which wasn't easy for black folk to accept, and that was they should invite imprisonment. And so the idea as part of this would be to start a campaign known as the Defiance Campaign. I think I touched on that in the previous lecture, where we spoke then about a small committee that Mandela was a part of, and that they had decided to write a letter to D.F. Malan, and that in that letter would be a request to repeal the so-called 6 unjust laws. I think I might have mentioned that, I don't know. But here, so here you had the pragmatic and strategic Mandela emerging, because despite his inherent African nationalism, which still he maintained at this point, he was for the first time publicly arguing for a united front with so-called colored and Indian folk and colored and Indian political organizations to form a shared front against apartheid. Africans, in his view, should be at the spearhead of the struggle, but should see Indians and coloreds, I'm sorry for the racist terminology, it's South African racist terminology, as allies in the struggle against apartheid. And I think we spoke about the fact that Mandela knew that the cost of mass action and the cost of this program that had been put in place for the first time would be high, and that would include harsh confrontation that would probably lead to death. So the letter went off to Milan. Milan's secretary replied, and I think I mentioned the fact that the reply was that the distinctions between people on the basis of color were God-given, not man-made, and that they were there to stay, and that the laws were not oppressive, but indeed supportive. 4 days before the Defiance campaign started, Mandela made a speech and referred to the Defiance campaign as an event where black South Africans were making history, and I quote from Sampson, these are his words, "We can now say that unity between the non-European people in this country has become a living reality." So we can see the nationalism of Mandela still in his heart, but we can see the pragmatic Mandela beginning to say, well, we need to do more in relation to getting people together, and that transcends color. Of course, you will see to what extent he soon began to embrace everyone and how his African nationalism changed. Yes, sir?
When was ANC formed?
1912.
Before that?
Yes. And of course, the idea is that from 1912 till around 1951-52, it was a moribund organization, a supplicatory organization where black folk would go hat in hand to the white master and say, "Excuse me, sir, please, do you think you might adjust these laws because they don't really feel good with." It was an ineffectual organization, which is why the Defiance campaign was so historic, because the young folk at that point in time, Walter Sisulu, Nelson Mandela and others, were beginning to say, we want this plan of mass action, we want to take this to the oppressor, and we want to make sure that they feel it. And so they put together this plan, which is why this is historic. Mandela spent his first 2 nights in jail just before the Defiance campaign. And an experience that shaped him in that jail was a most unfortunate experience, which of course was replicated many times over in the years to come. And this is that he found out that he was spending time in jail with 2 police informers who had been planted by the regime into that situation. And of course, that's a clever tactic, and that tactic only worsened. And so when we talk about Mandela in just before his release in that house he was given, the entire thing was wired up by the national intelligence. And so, you know, from this experience, Mandela learned a lot, because the question then became, well, who can I trust? And trust throughout the entire freedom struggle was a huge deal. It was a big deal. The precursor to the National Intelligence Service was a thing called BOSS. And it sounds ominous, and it was ominous. It was the Bureau of State Security. And so that thing, together with the military intelligence and the police intelligence organizations, used to infiltrate and plant. And so spying and counter-spying and espionage, it became really messy. So this was his first taste of police informants. About 8,000 people broke the law in the Defiance campaign. About 8,000 people across the sort of the period of half a year invited incarceration and were incarcerated and paid fines and so forth, paid heavy prices if you think of their circumstances. You know, a 25 pound fine in those days for a black South African who didn't have the money to catch a bus was a huge deal. And of course, the fact that they went to jail was a big thing as well. And so the success of the Defiance campaign and the success of Mandela and Sisulu and others remains contested in history. And if you read various sources, you will see different perspectives on the impact and effectiveness of the Defiance campaign. But from Mandela's perspective, it did at least 2 things for him. Although he was disappointed with the outcome, let me say that. He felt that the campaign had given black people a new sense of ability to stand up to the oppressor, and it gave them a sense of their own strength and confidence that there was an organization that was no longer taking that back seat in advocating for their plight. And the second thing that happened was it removed the stigma of going to jail. It in fact replaced that stigma with a sense of it's a badge of honor to say, I threw away my passbook and went to jail, and it's okay that I went to jail. I wasn't a bad person because I went to jail. Up to that point, you know, it wasn't a good thing to go to jail. It became a good thing. The government's response, predictably, was one of brutal and oppressive violence, and Mandela and 20 other Defiance campaign leaders were arrested. They were arrested under the Suppression of Communism Act. And I think we spoke about the nature of the definitions of some of these acts. Sampson talks about this as being a palpably perverse, I think I might have mentioned this definition, but it's certainly the act and the anti-communist type activities at the time helped the apartheid regime get support, especially from the West and from the US, where, as Sampson then writes ironically, the Cold War, and I quote, was hotting up on page 69. The Defiance campaign petered out. It petered out under the pressure of legislation, which then became ever more draconian. So the government passed legislation that it was then automatic if you participated in the Defiance campaign to get 3 years in jail, and you would start that off with a flogging. So you wouldn't just go in, you would be flogged in. And Mandela then did receive a suspended sentence with hard labor, and was then after that banned outright for 6 months. So the question of the success of the Defiance campaign is contested, but in some respects you can see how it might have well been of benefit to the African National Congress. The other thing that it did was it scared off timid leaders making a bid for the leadership of the African National Congress. The time for those timid leaders had come and passed. And so Albert Luthuli became the president of the African National Congress in 1952, a deeply religious, a deeply devout man imbued with Christian values, and a man who respected Gandhi and was all about Gandhi's style of opposition to an oppressor. Mandela differed from Gandhi, but he respected Mandela differed from Luthuli, but he respected Luthuli to the end and has always referred to him as a hero of the struggle. Part of the reason why the Defiance campaign is contested in terms of its impact is because it made no dent on the white way of life. The white folk at the time hardly even noticed that it had happened, and in fact the international community didn't care either.
Why did you differ from, what are the reasons for differing from the other leaders? What's the reason that he did not agree with them? What's the point on which he did not agree with them?
Mandela, A, wasn't as religiously devout as Luthuli, and secondly, didn't embrace only Gandhian tactics in relation to opposing the apartheid regime. And we'll talk a little bit later on. In fact, I don't want to give away my most unfortunate surprise, because it relates also to that. And yes, it is true that I have to describe the... Thank you so much. So what were the factors that were now beginning to emerge that were continuously shaping Mandela? We've spoken about some in relation to his childhood. You remember Gower and the bus boycotts and so forth. the contradictory nature of the Defiance campaign, the fact that Mandela felt some of this action had actually made a difference, but that white people didn't care, and that the international community didn't care, that no one gave a hoot that mattered, that affected Mandela. The spider's web of apartheid legislation that was emerging, and sort of 52 had begun really to be implemented and gain traction on the black folk in South Africa. This was obviously affecting Mandela. In terms of its implementation, and I want to dwell on this a little bit if you'll allow me, the fact that people were then forcibly removed in order to implement this policy, and the question of Sophiatown, which I want to turn to now, impacted hugely on Mandela. The end of mission education, the government had put through the Bantu Education Act, which meant that Mandela's education and access to it for generations after him was no longer possible. That affected Mandela. Coupled with the fact, and I do hope we have time to talk about these things as well, coupled with the fact that the government had introduced the Group Areas Act and the creation of what it called Bantustans. Have you heard about these countries? So remember, the black person in South Africa was not viewed as a citizen of South Africa. Under apartheid, they were viewed as temporary sojourners, sojourning temporarily in this white homeland. And the idea with the Bantustans was to create sovereign states based on ethnicity, where black people, so if you were a Zulu, you'd have your state, and if you were a Xhosa, you'd have your state, etc., where black people would ultimately go. And that would be their country, and the rest of the country would be owned by the Afrikaner, and that was the idea, if you like, behind apartheid. And so what happened was, not only did the mission education collapse, but the first Bantustan, if I remember correctly, would be a thing called the Transkei, and Qunu, where Mandela, well, wasn't born, but where he grew up, was smack bang in the middle of that Bantustan. And the entire area where he had his childhood was being turned then into an apartheid country, a Bantustan, a black homeland. There are many different ways of referring to these things, which have been abolished, of course. And then an event known as Sharpeville, where a large number of black folk were shot in the back at a protest. I think it was early 60s, 62, 63. This impacted also 62, I think, or maybe even 61. This impacted on Mandela, all ultimately combining to form the cumulative effect of the abject horror of apartheid on the daily existence of the vast majority of South Africans, all shaping and affecting Mandela. Now, I'm getting to that answer and that unfortunate point that I need to make. But by the time Mandela got to his early 30s, he was being pulled in contradictory directions. He had a thriving legal practice. He was a lawyer. By day, he was a practicing lawyer. He was hugely busy. But he was also increasingly being caught up in what the Defiance campaign meant. And in some respects, he was beginning to engage with the idea of revolutionary politics. And part of that was because he was thinking about the impact of the Defiance campaign and saying, is it always going to be the case that if we protest peacefully, we will always be met with brutal violence and death? Is that always going to be the inevitable outcome of our confrontations with the state? He'd established the first law firm in South Africa, a black or African law firm, Mandela and Tambo, his partner Tambo, with whom he would form a hugely important relationship across the decades ahead. And they had a very busy, thriving practice. They complemented each other in terms of style, and this is important for Mandela, and if I'm not careful, I'm going to digress here, so I have to rein myself in, because Mandela's legal practice gave him the opportunity to be in court, and it was here where Mandela began to develop his flamboyant, assertive, theatrical style, as opposed to Tambo, who was the quieter one, the more intellectual one, the one who stayed back in the practice, did all the paperwork, kept the thing running that way. And Mandela was of course, making use also of the symbolism that was always part of his natural inclination. And so my digression, ladies and gentlemen, would be, please not to fall into the trap that Mandela put on a rugby jersey and united us by putting on that jersey. Of course he did. But let it not be the only time that resonates in your mind as a time when he used symbolism. You know, in some respects, it makes me feel uncomfortable because it's always in relation to, it's always the benchmark of the white South African. And so all of a sudden he put on the rugby jersey and hey ho, he used symbolism. No. You know, he was a symbol throughout the struggle. We weren't allowed to see images of him whilst he was incarcerated. His image was banned, yet his image survived. It's a symbol right through the struggle for freedom. We might, if we have time, get to the Rivonia trial when he was sentenced almost sentenced to death. He turned up in full Xhosa chief regalia. Why did he do that? He wasn't playing to, you know, the audience with the white rugby jersey at that time. So all I want to do is say, yes, he did use symbolism, but you know, the way we sometimes put it about in the public domain is that was the symbolic Mandela. No. And I like to debunk that myth. So sorry for that digression. He treated white magistrates with contempt. If you look on page 80 of the biography, you'll see that. And here's an interesting thing, because the word that's used is bewilder. He would bewilder white magistrates by referring to black folk who had been brought into the courtroom as Mr. Shabalala or Mr. Mandela or Mrs. He would treat them with respect as human beings, as you would wish me to address you, and vice versa. They were bewildered. They weren't even just upset, they were bewildered. And again, one could digress because, you know, black South Africans were certainly males were known as boy. You know, a white South African in the heyday of apartheid wouldn't even use the word boy. They would use a word which we simply don't even use in South Africa anymore. It's so incendiary. And in fact, you know, I can use it because Mandela said it. And perhaps if he said it, it comes across in a better way. And I didn't have any intention of doing this right now, but in his own biography, which is a good read in and of itself, he says of the time when the National Party came into power, he says, if we had any hopes or illusions about the National Party before they came into office, we were disabused of them quickly. Their threat to put the Kaffir in his place was not an idle one. And then he goes on into all the acts and the legislation and so forth. And so, of course, that is how white folk would have referred to black folk at the time. And even to this day, ladies and gentlemen, let us not be under any illusions. You know, a garden boy is a thing which almost every middle-class white South African had. And a girl working in the kitchen and doing the washing, yeah, and I use those words, you know, this is how it was. This is how it was in South Africa. And so, of course, he wanted to challenge that. He had a relatively public platform. He did that to great effect. But white lawyers didn't like that. And the Law Society didn't like that. And so what happened was the fact that he'd been incarcerated, I don't think it's good for a lawyer to be in jail, apparently. It's not a good thing. They demanded, the Law Society in 54 demanded that he be removed from the role. He took the Law Society to court, and he won that case. And when he came out of jail, he was proud to say in one or two of his speeches that I am still on the roll to this day. I've never been taken off as a practicing lawyer. But here, if you've been listening to me, and perhaps I haven't been as articulate and eloquently articulate as I might be, and I always do struggle with that, maybe you can begin to see the dilemma that was emerging in Mandela's mind and heart. Because if you think about a thriving legal practice and politics on the other, and you can begin to see that he's feeling, well, this defiance campaign, where did it take us? And it ended up with so many thousands of us in jail and some of us dead and so forth. He was becoming increasingly divided by his great respect for the rule of law, and let me emphasize that. He's always said that, and it's always been the case. He's had a great respect for the South African, and also, interestingly enough, the British legal system, and indeed the British way of doing politics. He liked the Westminster system of politics. On the one hand, his respect for law, and on the other, his determination to rid the country of this racist regime. And this was a moral dilemma, an ethical dilemma for the emerging Mandela. He was becoming increasingly aware that the state's repression would debilitate the African National Congress in terms of the path that Walter Sisulu had put it on, and that legal and bureaucratic and military might would debilitate the African National Congress by restricting its leaders, and indeed by introducing what the British colonial masters were good at, and what the Afrikaner learned from them, which is dividing across factional and ethnic lines, and in that way trying to conquer. So he put together a thing called the M Plan, which was essentially, and I really do summarize, a system allowing leaders within the African National Congress to secretly communicate with each other through a network of underground cells. And the main objective of the M Plan was, besides trying to work around all this draconian stuff that was happening, to enable black South Africans to mobilize, recruit, and inform each other of activities. And indeed, I quote him on page 82 in Samson. He says, "You must make every home, every shack, and every mud structure where our people live a branch of the trade union movement, and you must never surrender." So Mandela then, at this point, was faced with this challenge of forced removals. And with the question of Sophiatown, I might want to show you a short clip, 4 or 5 minutes, if that's okay. Maybe I'll say one or two things quickly before that. Sophiatown was a multiracial township near Johannesburg. It was a so-called black spot. A black spot which the government at the time was determined to eradicate, and indeed to move to Soweto. It was in some senses an overcrowded slum, but it was also one of South Africa's most successful cosmopolitan areas. An area where, in the context of the laissez-faire apartheid that I had described prior to 48, folk had gravitated towards and lived quite happily together. Now, our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when it was dealing with the emergent horrors of apartheid, also had to think about how people would be told the story of what had happened. And one of the ways in which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission told the story was by using the public broadcaster, the South African Broadcasting Commission. And so every week on a Sunday, we'd have a summary of the week's events at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission lasted 2 years. These broadcasts lasted about 2 years. And so we would watch with horror, of course, as the story of apartheid unfolded across these two years, broadcast also on our public broadcaster, between an hour and a half in length. The entire collection, a student summarized for me. I'm very grateful to that student for having done that particular piece of work. And all the footage, including this footage that I'm about to show you, is still available publicly. Yeah? So if we think about, and I know this is not a lecture on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we could do a series on that too, by the way. One of the characteristics that differentiate it from so many others is the fact that we did it in public. We washed our dirty laundry in public. We showed everyone, warts and all, what had happened from all sides. Yeah? And we had Desmond Tutu to thank for that, for chairing in the particular way that he did that. And I should show you some footage of him getting Valentine's Day roses from all the lovely ladies he worked with. It's a tearjerker to see them queuing up, giving him these and thanking him for what he did. So the point is, the point literally is, one of the things we had to come to terms with was the fact that it wasn't only individual human rights abuses, but also human rights abuses on a large scale. Whole communities were abused, and some of that is difficult to understand and difficult to figure out in a process. And of course, South Africans wanted to know about that. This clip was so popular in South Africa that it was aired twice. And I will show you another such clip, perhaps next week, which was so popular, I think it was shown 2 or 3 times. And this clip gives you a sense of, there's some interviews in it, and a bit of footage, gives you a sense of Sophiatown. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about why it impacted on Mandela. Let me see if I can find it.
Welcome back. The Truth Commission has the task of investigating gross human rights violations in our past. Some of these violations happen to communities and are hard to investigate as individual human rights violations, like the forced removal of black people who lived in areas where the National Party government did not want them to be. One such a place was Sophiatown in Johannesburg.
Marvelous, folks.
The name Sophiatown has become much more than a symbol of the forced removal of black people by the apartheid government. It was a magic moment in the history of the people of South Africa, a moment holding the promise of what South Africa could have been.
Dance, and we used to sit here. My mother was very strict. I couldn't cross the road. I just had to sit there at the stoop and watch. Sometimes I used to feel scared because, when they danced, they just went on their, jumped on their tummies like this with nothing on their, bodies and that.
Sophiatown was truly a melting pot, a place where musicians, artists, writers, and gangsters combined to create an excitement that is still remembered with nostalgia. People lived as if they were free in a time that white capital and Afrikaner nationalism gathered forces to formalize a most restrictive ideology. Sophiatown was the embryo of an exciting South Africa, culturally and politically. And that was exactly why it had to be destroyed, because it threatened the designs of racial separation and white Calvinist superiority.
It was the first black urban experience, which expressed itself.
There was a huge new surge of an urban folk who were establishing, I think, a kind of an urban folklore. Your writers of the time, your journalists, your shakers and movers of the place.
Sophiatown happened almost by accident. The owner of the farm Waterval, one H. Dobianski, planned a private leasehold township for low-income white people. He named the development after his wife, Sophia, but he failed to attract white buyers to the area. It became a place where black people could buy land, and they did, alongside Chinese, coloreds, and Indians. As white South Africans rallied to bring the National Party to power in 1948, black South Africans were creating the first truly non-racial society in the country.
Sophiatown was a representative of freedom to live with whoever was your neighbor.
It was too much of a threat. In February 1955, trucks rolled into Sophiatown, loaded its inhabitants, and moved them to a place called Meadowlands.
The shocking images of Sophiatown, people just being uprooted and carted away, much against their will, and quite hopelessly, you know, struggling against this thing. The machine of the National Party government at the time was just simply too strong.
Sophiatown was razed to the ground, as if to erase the memory of what could have been. And in its place came triumph, victory. The sterile suburban streets that emerged in its place were indeed seen as a triumph for white rule. The spirit of Sophiatown was broken, its people dispersed. But in the life of a nation, 40 years is not that long. And last year, Triumph became Sophiatown again, as South Africans started regaining their dignity. One cannot help but wonder, what would our society have looked like today if the magic of Sophiatown had not been destroyed?
It was a fluent kind of living, vibrant community, and I think longing for the kind of freedom that hopefully we're getting into now. That's what made it such a magical place. And I think it'll always hold a place in the imaginations of the people who lived through it, and maybe those who didn't. As we can say, it's an original.
So,
Excuse me,
yes, sir.
where was that geographically to Soweto? Is that anywhere close?
Yes, south of Johannesburg, and very close. Yeah. It's of course one does wonder where to start now. In some respects, and of course the place to start is that it no longer is called Triumph, which is the Afrikaans for triumph, as you heard there. So that is the place to start, and of course we should really be smiling, but it isn't that easy necessarily, certainly for those folk who've been and seen some of our museums, that you shouldn't think of Sophiatown on its own. My town, Port Elizabeth, we had South End.
What's there today in the where Sophiatown was?
It is that which became. So it became a whites-only area, but it's no longer whites-only. And so all of that pernicious apartheid legislation's been abolished. The structures that were put in place after the others were broken down, those remain, and have been modified, etc. And of course, it's a fashionable place. It's a place you want to go to. It's a place you want to say, you know, yeah, I'm there. So in that respect, so what's there in one respect is apartheid bricks and mortar, and tarmac and stuff, but the spirit has been restored, and I think that's why I'm saying there's a good news story to start from, but that the story is a hard one to tell when one then begins to think of the magnitude, and that's why I'm saying don't think of Sophiatown. You know, District 6 in Cape Town for so-called coloured people, South End in Port Elizabeth, and the list goes on and on and on. The idea was all black spots would be removed. The idea was that this was happening across the entire country, and Sophiatown was but one manifestation of the implementation of policy in relation to the Group Areas Act, and that it was abhorrent, also morally and ethically for the Afrikaner, and biblically for different colours to live cheek by jowl, live together, never mind get married, etc., etc. So the idea was to move people apart based on their colour, and you saw how they did that. It was pretty brutal. It was pretty horrific. And where were these folk placed? There was nothing where they went in most instances. There wasn't even sewage. There wasn't even electricity. There wasn't anything other than flat land. Yes, ma'am? That's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question. Where do you think the allegiance of the Afrikaner might have been with the Nazis? And so the Boer, the Afrikaner government that came into power, its allegiance was, and if you think about the ideological similarities, so the Aryan, superiority, the question of genetics and blood and so forth, you can see how, you can see that. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yes, sir.
Do you allow trivial questions?
Yes, any questions are good questions. I do.
If the town was named after Sophia,
Yes.
how did it become Sophia town?
So Sophia is probably a pronunciation thing. Yeah, it's a great question. South Africans abuse English, and we have 11 languages. And thank you. So I give you a potentially trivial answer, and I believe that there's a 12th language, which is called Tsotsitaal. And that's an interesting thing because Taal is Afrikaans and Tsotsi is a kind of Xhosa. And what it is a mishmash of all 11. So,
It's also called the Mind Work Language.
yeah, and thank you, and that's where it emerged and is now popular in that area. So when I went to South Africa the other day, a few months ago, and was ordering something, we were talking about the languages, and someone said, Clive, there's a 12th language. It's this Tsotsitaal. It should be put into the Constitution. Yes, sir.
Yes. Did the people of color in South Africa, were they aware of the civil rights movement and the Jim Crow in the United States?
Yes. And in fact, it remains an ambition of mine, together with some of my colleagues on this campus, to parallel and draw for us. And at one point I was thinking about, when John Siegenthaler was still alive, I had the odd conversation with him. Not odd conversation, but odd conversation. Where are we going now? And they have in the First Amendment Center sort of photographs, and I was often thinking also about downtown in the library, if there was some way in which we could parallel the struggle. I just yesterday spoke to a student who is graduating and who wants to do something with me in relation to that. And I do feel that there is probably more we can do. So we know, that there were influences. We know that some of our leaders greatly admired what was happening here in relation to Martin Luther King and others, and that there was some. But what we also know, of course, now information travels. But we do know that there was no internet and email and stuff, and so it wasn't as easy as it might be today in terms of, you and I exchanging information about ideas and actions and stuff. But it did exist. And again, we could probably spend some time unpacking that. I've done a little bit of that in relation to black consciousness and W.E.B. Du Bois and Malcolm X and others, and thinking about Stephen Bantu Biko and Anton Lembede and others. But in terms of two broad movements, I don't think we've done enough, perhaps, to unpack some of that. So the first point I wanted to make in the little time, what time do we end at 12 o'clock? okay, so we have some time, is that was not a one-off, and it was not just Sophiatown. It was literally across the country, so you should see that writ large across the entire South Africa. Do not think of that as a one-off thing. The second thing is, and this is perhaps where I'm heading towards again, in a sense, is it is documented. So me asking you the question would be a rhetorical question. So Mandela ran a legal practice. Of course, there were many folk who wanted to go to court over being forcibly evicted from land that they bought. They owned the land. They had bought this land. They owned this land. He represented a lot of those clients. Do you think he could stop those forced removals? Is the rhetorical question, of course. And the answer is that tide of destruction across the country, but then in particular in relation to how it made him feel ineffectual in the face of this huge change in relation to the implementation of apartheid legislation and what it meant to be implemented. This left him feeling completely helpless. It was clear to Mandela that he could neither beat the government and, moreover, and this is the unfortunate surprise, that he could not achieve through peaceful means what he might want to achieve. Mandela began to urgently advocate for an armed struggle. So much so that he urged Walter Sisulu to travel to China. And in part because militant youth, after Defiance campaign, after Sophiatown writ large across the country, after all the horrors that were being experienced in South Africa, were coming into his legal practice and saying, Madiba, we've had enough. If you don't do something, we are going to do something. And we know what we want to do. We're going to go and get AK-47s, and we're going to fight, because this is what we're getting. So the government triumphed, named that new white area Triumph, and Mandela was saying, Walter, you need to go to China. Why do you need to go to China? You need to go to China to see if they can give us arms. We want arms. The African National Congress needs arms. He had no authorization for this, by the way, and Luthuli had no idea. So Sisulu went to China, and the Chinese gave him an interesting answer. They said to Sisulu, and he came back and told Mandela, do not come to this solution until you are ready for this solution. It sounds like a typical Chinese kind of Confucian, and absolutely the right kind of advice is, now, are you ready? Do you know what you're letting yourself in for? And so he didn't get the answer he expected. Mandela was still insistent on this, but agreed through discussion in this Ubuntu style that he was behaving like a revolutionary hothead, that he'd been precipitate, and that the time wasn't right for what was brewing inside his heart, but not only his, but a lot of young black people in the streets out in South Africa. He remained a maverick, though, within the ANC. From here onwards, as the biography notes, he was a loose cannon, and he began to attract increasing attention from the security police and the government because of his fiery speeches and his rhetoric, and the fact that at this point, following Sophiatown and the fact that he couldn't make a legal dent, he seemed to be spoiling for a fight. So he was metamorphosing, he was changing. I'm reminded of Kafka's story about Gregor Samsa, but I shouldn't go there. African nationalism metamorphosing into pragmatic and then ideological embracing of a multiracial South Africa on the one hand, and this question of ineffectual opposition pushing him from peaceful protest towards violence. And remember, we did talk about, right at the beginning, the fact that Mandela himself said he was no angel. So he remained an African nationalist and pragmatically sought these allies wherever he could find them, but now began to find that his staunchest allies came from the South African Communist Party. And so he began forging and forming relationships and alliances with the South African Communist Party. And it was this relationship that the government, of course, sought, particularly in court, whenever they dragged African National Congress activists into court, sought to highlight this relationship between the South African Communist Party and the African National Congress. Now, in this time, whilst Mandela was thinking about what he might do and how he might respond, and the inner turmoil in relation to violence and law and peaceful protest and so forth, the party itself was beginning to talk about the development of a thing known as the Freedom Charter. And again, if I digress, have any of you been to Kliptown near Soweto? And have any of you been to the site of where the Freedom Charter was, adopted? Maybe, you see, maybe, you see, maybe. And I ask that question, it's not a trick question, because I don't think we South Africans have made enough of the importance of this document and the symbolic nature of that site. I've been to that site. There's a tower and there's something inside with a flame, and you've been there. And there are some words of the Freedom Charter around it, and there's an awful looking shopping center next to it. Why did I say that? Well, it's interesting, you know, the Apartheid Museum was put in, so you've been to the Apartheid Museum, it was put in place by the Koch brothers because they wanted the casino license, of course, and they wanted the casino there. So you were told, well, okay, you want a casino, you have to do something with a social conscience, or however you wish to express it. So what do? And of course, it's an important thing, and we go there, and quite frankly, it's a relatively good museum. It didn't have a Truth and Reconciliation room, and I believe it's not yet complete, but be that as it may. And of course, these two brothers, you know how they made their money. Yeah, so black woman wanted to be white. How do you become white? Apparently you rub some sort of cream on your skin and you become white. They sold millions and millions and millions of these things of cream, enough to, be successful. Yeah, this is apartheid. This is about black consciousness. This is about human dignity. This is about the effects of systems like this. If you're beginning to think about the systemic effects, the bigger picture effects here, then you're beginning to see what you're doing to human beings. You're beginning to see how an entire system like that produced people who didn't believe in themselves. You're beginning to see how successful in many respects, especially with the older generations, the system actually was in saying to folk, or at least in them saying to themselves, yeah, I am actually not worth anything. Yeah, I am meant to be second class or third class. Yeah, I can't achieve educationally. I am who I am. And it is there where the importance of Steve Biko and others come in relation to rekindling the sense of human dignity and igniting that, and that sense of self-worth. But now I have really digressed. Yes, ma'am.
What percent of the blacks in South Africa belonged to the ANC during this process, and how did they communicate?
Yeah, so...
Because obviously they weren't going to be on state television.
And that's, again, a very good question. Where to start? There were a number of, so the first thing to say is who was black. And so we know black people were black, colored, and Indian. And in some respects, organizations had formed around color, and there were multiple organizations besides the black ANC. And so there was the Transvaal Indian Congress and the Natal Indian Congress, and there was a Coloured People's Association down in the Western Cape, and there were many other. So thinking, as you correctly point out, of a homogeneous and monolithic African National Congress is fallacious, and I'm painting a picture which is much more complex and much more fragmented and fractured, if you like, and even within the African National Congress, as we shall shortly see, due to this Freedom Charter that I want to talk about. Even there are differences in terms of nationalisms and ethnicities and allegiances and so forth. And of course the South African Communist Party, the first multiracial political party and organization in South Africa. So the answer to your question is they communicated by whatever means they could. Sometimes they didn't like each other and also beat each other up. They communicated in many different ways. They formed alliances when it was expeditious to do so, when it was expedient to do so. They disrupted each other's meetings. They tried to do things together. They tried to do things against each other. And we'll see how the African National Congress split, in fact, because of some of those differences. So we are heading towards a split in the African National Congress here shortly. And yes, you're right. I don't know the percentages. They would vacillate over time and change. But ultimately, what was known as mass democratic movement in the 80s was an umbrella movement which then made the final push towards negotiations. South Africans have never been unified. We don't do that. There's an Afrikaans word called dwars. In German it's schräg, and that means skew. And so we're always differing from each other. The only time in South Africa's history that the Afrikaner was ever united was in 48. That's how they got into power. And the only time all of these factions were relatively united in the context of the struggle was in the 80s. And even there were differences, but there was a knowledge that you needed to unite to push. And so we've always differed, and we've always been different and contradictory. So the development of the Freedom Charter was the point in the history of the African National Congress, and indeed Nelson Mandela's personal development, where for the first time African nationalism was being discarded, and a document, a manifesto, even a constitution, if you like, a blueprint for a future constitution, was being produced, which embraced multiracialism. The idea for this document didn't come from Mandela. It came from someone who had spent some time here in the US. In fact, Z.K. Matthews, and when he was kicked out of the US, he went back to South Africa and had this idea of a Freedom Charter. He formally proposed the Freedom Charter in 1953, and he proposed another thing, which would be proposed twice, in fact, once by him and once by Mandela. So he proposed this constitutional blueprint known as the Freedom Charter, and he proposed a national convention of all races to sit down and talk, discuss the future, and figure out a way forward. Does that sound like something that might have happened in South Africa? I mean, I get emotional just thinking about it. I mean, you know, it's the mid-50s, and Z.K. Matthews is proposing a national convention, and the African National Congress is putting forward a constitutional blueprint and saying, hey, folk, let's get together and have a convention. That's what we did in the 90s. You know, we called it a Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA. And so, forgive me a little bit of emotion, but that, I mean, at that time, was pretty advanced. To draw up then this Freedom Charter for the democratic South Africa of the future. Mandela welcomed that idea of the convention. He welcomed it not only in and of its moral and ethical and value, but also as typical of Mandela, as a demonstration of public strength. And indeed compared the convention and the Freedom Charter in importance to the very formation of the African National Congress itself in 1912. For him, this was another seminal historic moment, this proposal. There was tension, as that question helped me answer, within the African National Congress about the nature of the oppression that black people were experiencing. There were some Marxists in the African National Congress who felt it was a class struggle. There were Christian folk united under Luthuli who believed that it was a question of divine discontent. And then simply some nationalists as well, African nationalists, who refused to allow collaboration, if you like, with other races. And so these debates and discussions about the nature of the Freedom Charter and what it was committing the African National Congress to in terms of values and for a future country, but also in terms of a practical program of action, i.e. involving everyone, there was a lot of dissent in the African National Congress around this. But ultimately, I guess in the spirit of Ubuntu, the need for the Freedom Charter and the convention, these were agreed, and a Congress of the African National Congress agreed that preparations should be made for a Congress of the people. The date was set for the 26th of June 1955, and to adopt the Freedom Charter. And it was, I guess, a little controversially, because we don't know, the police piled in and disrupted the event. Was it ratified? Wasn't it ratified? Did folk have enough time before the police disrupted that event to ratify it? But then, in the context of that uncertainty, the African National Congress itself adopted it formally in 1956 as its fundamental manifesto. The document's economic provisions remained controversial even through the negotiation process. So this document has then resonated through the rest of history and still resonates in some respects. Its economic provisions were always controversial. And those, of course, related to the fact that who owned the mineral wealth and the land, and the call for nationalization of state assets, land, and so forth is contained as a clause in the Freedom Charter. And Mandela, over time in courts, has been at pains to unpack that. It's often been referred to as an embryo of a socialist state. I know when you say the word socialism here in the US, it conjures up images of the devil incarnate, and I think it does, and so it did in this time as well. And so some of the content of the Freedom Charter was, especially for the Afrikaner, very much a problem. I almost feel like I want to stop here with Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect, the arch-architect of apartheid, because it's almost a natural point to start next time, is to say, so enter Verwoerd, this awful man who was ultimately murdered in Parliament by a guy with the surname of Tsafendas, who believed a worm had told him that this man was evil and needed to be murdered. Let me stop here, and thank you for your attention. Thank you so much for your attention.